What if one simple wire, nothing more than a scrap of copper twisted by a bored mechanic, completely changed the balance of air power in the Pacific? It sounds ridiculous, right? But sometimes history isn't rewritten by generals or engineers in pristine offices. It's changed by someone in a dusty airfield under the burning sun doing something everyone else called stupid. The Lockheed P-38. Lightning was supposed to be the U.S. Air Force's ace in the hole. Twin engines, turbo-supercharged, blistering speed. It looked like something from the future when it first hit the skies in World War II. Nicknamed the fork-tailed devil by the Germans, it was fast, deadly, and unlike anything else flying at the time. But in the Pacific, against Japan's A6M-0, the story was different, painfully different. American pilots found themselves constantly outturned, outclimbed, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, outgunned. The Zero, light and agile, danced through the air like a ghost. The P-38, for all its power, felt sluggish in comparison. Pilots complained that by the time they got the Lightning lined up for a shot, the Zero was already gone. It was a humiliating mismatch, and one that no amount of bravery could fix. That's when a nameless, overworked mechanic supposedly did something nobody expected. Somewhere on a tropical airstrip lined with dust and sweat, he looked at the Lightning's complex system of valves, linkages, and control wires, and decided to ignore the manual. What he did wasn't authorized. It wasn't even smart by official standards. In fact, when word got around, other mechanics reportedly laughed it off as stupid. But within days, pilots began to whisper that their planes were climbing faster, they were accelerating harder, and suddenly the Zero didn't seem untouchable anymore. It wasn't a new engine or a new weapon that changed things. It was a wire. A piece of metal rerouted through the P-38's turbo-supercharger system, forcing the engines to gulp more air, burn hotter, and make more power at higher altitudes. No paperwork, no redesign, just one guy's gut feeling and a roll of wire. But here's the wild part. That unapproved field modification might have been the single moment that let P-38s start turning the tables in the Pacific skies. Pilots who'd once dreaded facing the nimble Zeros suddenly found themselves dictating the fight, zooming higher, diving faster, and striking with an advantage the Japanese never saw coming. Was it genius? Luck? Or just desperation? Maybe all three. But what's certain is that this stupid little trick, this hacked-together wire job, did something that entire engineering teams back home hadn't figured out yet. It changed how one of the most iconic planes of World War II flew, fought, and survived. And the story of how that happened, how a single wire helped the P-38 outfly the legendary Zero, starts with understanding just how big the problem really was. Because before the miracle came the mess. On paper, the P-38 Lightning was unbeatable. Two turbo-supercharged Allison engines, counter-rotating propellers, and a nose packed with machine guns and a cannon. It was a flying fortress for one man. But out in the real world, in the choking humidity and salt air of the Pacific, that dream machine had a serious problem. It wasn't living up to its legend. Pilots expected power, speed, dominance. What they got was frustration. The P-38's engines were temperamental, its cooling systems delicate, and its performance at high altitude wildly inconsistent. Some days it climbed like a rocket. Other days it gasped for air, sputtering when the turbo-supercharger refused to play nice with the tropical heat. Maintenance crews cursed the thing. Pilots joked that it had more plumbing than a city block. At the same time, their enemy, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was everything the Lightning wasn't. Simple, light, agile. Japanese pilots could pull tight turns the Americans couldn't dream of. A single Zero could twist and climb away from a pair of P-38s before they even got guns on target. The Lightning's twin-engine design gave it power, sure, but it also gave it weight. And in a turning fight, weight was death. The biggest insult? The P-38 had been designed to dominate the skies of Europe, to chase down bombers at 30,000 feet over France. But in the Pacific, combat often happened low and fast, at barely 10,000 feet over jungle and ocean. Down there, the turbo superchargers didn't behave the way Lockheed's engineers expected. The system, built for thin, cold air, became sluggish and unreliable in the tropics. And so, what should have been America's super fighter turned into a mechanical headache. Pilots began to doubt it. Some even asked to transfer to other squadrons. Rumors spread that the P-38 simply couldn't hack it against the Japanese Zero. In a way, they were right. The Lightning could never match the Zero in a tight turn, but it wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to outpower it, not out-twist it. The problem was, it couldn't even do that consistently. Every squadron mechanic knew the supercharger system was the heart of the problem. It was brilliant, but overcomplicated. Automatic controls were supposed to balance boost pressure and temperature, but they often worked against the pilot, cutting power when it was needed most. Every time someone pulled into a climb to chase a Zero, they could feel the Lightning straining, coughing, lagging, like it wanted to go faster but wasn't being allowed to. So, imagine being a mechanic, working 14-hour days under a blistering sun, knowing your pilots were being shot down because some valve in the turbo system refused to cooperate. You'd want to fix it, wouldn't you? You'd want to find a way to make that beast breathe again. That's exactly what one mechanic decided to do. He didn't have new parts, he didn't have permission, but he did have wire, and an idea that sounded so reckless, so stupid, that no one believed it would work. And yet, that's where everything began to change. Because while the engineers were studying blueprints back home, one man was about to rewrite them, right there on the airstrip. To understand why that one wire mattered so much, you have to understand what the P-38 was up against. The Mitsubishi A6M0 wasn't just another fighter. It was the stuff of nightmares for Allied pilots in the early years of the war. The Zero looked delicate, almost fragile. Thin wings, bare-bones frame, barely any armor. But that was the secret. It didn't need armor. It didn't need to take hits if nobody could touch it. The plane was light enough to turn on a dime and climb like it had rockets strapped to it. In the hands of an experienced Japanese pilot, it was like watching an artist with a brush. Smooth, precise, effortless. When the Zero first appeared in 1940, it completely rewrote the rulebook of aerial combat. Allied pilots tried to dogfight it the way they were trained, and it was a massacre. The Zero could turn inside almost any fighter on the planet. It had an incredible range, twice that of most American planes, allowing it to strike targets no one thought reachable. Its guns weren't the most powerful, but in a close-range fight, accuracy and agility were all that mattered. By the time the P-38 Lightning entered combat in the Pacific, the Zero already had a terrifying reputation. Pilots whispered that once a Zero got on your tail, you were done. There was no shaking it. You'd try to dive away, but the Lightning had another hidden curse: compressibility. At high speeds, the controls stiffened so badly the pilot could barely move them. Some planes even broke apart when they dove too fast. The Zero, lighter and more flexible, could simply pull back and watch you crash yourself. American flyers had to learn the hard way that this wasn't a fair fight. The Zero's agility made it unbeatable in a turning dogfight, and its low-speed control let it dance around the Lightning like a leaf in the wind. P-38 pilots were told to never turn with a zero. Their only hope was to use the Lightning's strengths, its speed in a dive, its climb, its firepower, to strike and then run. Hit and run. Boom and zoom. Anything else was suicide. But there was a problem. That strategy only worked if the P-38 had enough power to climb out of danger and dive back in at will. And too often it didn't. The turbo superchargers meant to give the Lightning its edge were holding it back. Pilots could feel the plane bog down just when they needed it to surge ahead, and while they fought the controls, the Zero would sweep back around. Ready to finish the job, the Pacific skies turned into a deadly chess game, the Zero's agility versus the Lightning's potential power. For months, agility kept winning. American pilots watched friends vanish into fireballs. Mechanics watched planes return riddled with bullet holes, engines coughing, pilots furious. Everyone knew the P-38 could win, if only it could breathe right. And that's when one man, tired of losing pilots to a perfect enemy, decided he wasn't waiting for Washington or Lockheed to fix it. He was going to fix it himself. No one remembers his name. No official record lists it. Maybe it was lost in the chaos of war, or maybe the higher-ups decided it was better not to mention it at all. But somewhere out there, on a sweltering Pacific island covered in dust, sweat, and the smell of engine oil, a single mechanic looked at a grounded P-38 and decided he'd had enough. He wasn't a test pilot or an engineer. He was just a guy with grease on his hands and a brain that refused to accept that's just how it is. Day after day, he watched pilots stumble out of their cockpits, angry and defeated. Their planes weren't performing like they were supposed to. The turbo superchargers, those fancy, complex systems designed to make the Lightning unstoppable, were choking it instead. Now, the P-38's turbo system was a masterpiece of engineering, in theory. Two giant engines, each with a supercharger feeding compressed air through a network of pipes, valves, and controls that were meant to automatically balance everything out. It was all controlled by sensors and linkages that decided how much boost the engines got based on altitude and temperature. On paper, it was genius. In the field, it was a ticking headache. The mechanic had seen it all: boost valves locking up, controls sticking, turbo regulators cutting power at the worst moments. And every time he opened the engine cowling, it was the same tangle of wires and pipes mocking him. He knew what was wrong. The system was too smart for its own good. It was built to protect the engine, not to win a dogfight. One day, after watching yet another pilot limp back to base, he snapped. If the system was strangling the engines to protect them, what would happen if he stopped it from doing that? What if he just forced the turbos to stay open longer? It was a ridiculous idea, reckless, dangerous, probably career-ending if anyone found out. But at that point, he didn't care. So he took a piece of wire. Some say it was from a broken radio, others say it came from a scrap crate, and looped it around a small control linkage on the turbo regulator. By tying it back, he bypassed the automatic restriction that limited the engine's boost pressure. In essence, he told the engines, "Breathe all you want." When the first test run started, everyone expected smoke, maybe even an explosion. But instead, the P-38 roared like it had never roared before. The mechanic watched the turbo gauges climb past limits they'd never seen. The engines didn't choke. They didn't die. They just came alive. Word spread fast. Pilots who'd flown the wired Lightning swore it climbed faster, pulled harder, and ran smoother. They didn't know why, and they didn't care. For the first time in months, they had a machine that felt like it wanted to fight. The brass didn't approve it. It wasn't in any manual. But Quietly, around airfields across the Pacific, mechanics began copying the trick. A simple loop of wire was starting to give the Americans something they hadn't had in the skies for a long time: hope. But what came next proved this wasn't just a lucky hack. It was a revolution. When the first wired P-38 taxied out onto the runway, no one expected history to shift. It was just another maintenance check flight, another sweaty afternoon under the brutal Pacific sun. But the moment those twin Allisons throttled up, the ground crew knew something was different. The engines didn't whine or cough like usual. They screamed. The pilot lifted off, pushed the throttles forward, and climbed. Usually, this was where the Lightning struggled, lagging behind its reputation. Not this time. The climb rate shot up. The gauges pegged higher than they ever had before. The plane clawed through the air like it was lighter, hungrier, alive. When the pilot landed, he didn't even shut the engines down before shouting out of the cockpit, "What the did you do to my plane?" The mechanic, trying not to grin, just shrugged. "Fixed it." Within days, other pilots were begging for the same fix. They couldn't believe the difference. The P-38 that had once felt sluggish in a climb now powered up through the clouds. In combat, that change was everything. For the first time, Lightning pilots could meet Zeros on their own terms and beat them where it mattered most. Here's why that tiny change mattered so much. The Zero's biggest advantage was its agility at low speed, but it lost that edge at higher altitudes or when forced into vertical fights. Before the mod, the Lightning couldn't sustain climbs long enough to exploit that weakness. But with the wire bypass, its turbo superchargers stayed wide open, flooding the engines with air and raw power. Suddenly, the P-38 could pull out of dives faster, regain altitude quicker, and, most importantly, dictate the engagement. That meant the Zero pilots were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Veteran pilots later described it like flipping a switch. Before, the Zero could always climb away and reset the fight. After the modification, the Lightning could chase it all the way up. American squadrons began developing new tactics to use this edge: short, aggressive climbs followed by crushing dives. In those moments, the once feared Zero became helpless. Reports started coming in. Better kill ratios, cleaner missions, pilots returning alive who might not have before. Officially, no one mentioned the wire. It wasn't in any briefing, but every crew chief and pilot knew. You could tell by the subtle grin between mechanics, the unspoken secret that their stupid trick was working. The improved performance even began to attract attention from command staff. Test data started filtering back to Lockheed. Engineers were confused. Some P-38s were outperforming their specs in the field. Something wasn't adding up. Eventually, word leaked about the bypass. Instead of punishing anyone, Lockheed quietly tested the concept and found that, yes, it actually worked. That discovery led to refinements in later P-38 models, including the P-38J and L, which had redesigned turbo systems, stronger, faster, and capable of the power those field mechanics had forced into existence with nothing but wire and grit. In war, innovation doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from a frustrated mechanic staring at a mess of metal and thinking, there has to be a better way. And now that the Lightning had its breath back, the battle with the Zero was about to change forever. But the real test came when these wired Lightnings finally met the enemy head-on. The first time the wired P-38s met the Zero in combat, it wasn't just a dogfight, it was a statement. The skies above the Pacific had always belonged to the Japanese, where the Zero danced with impossible grace. But now, something felt different. The Lightnings didn't just attack, they owned the air. Before the modification, every P-38 pilot knew the rule: never turn with a zero. It was suicide. The Lightning simply couldn't pivot fast enough to stay on target, so they'd dive away, regroup, and hope to strike again before the Zeros closed in. But now, with the turbo superchargers running wide open, the Lightning had a new move in its playbook: the vertical climb. Instead of running, pilots began using energy fighting. They'd dive in from high altitude, rip through a formation of Zeros, and instead of pulling away, they'd shoot straight up, something they could never do before. The boosted engines hurled them skyward like rockets. Zeros tried to follow, but their light frames and weaker engines couldn't sustain the climb. Within seconds, they'd stall and fall back down, leaving the P-38s to roll over and dive again from above. It flipped the dynamic entirely. The Zeros, once the predators, suddenly found themselves trapped in a deadly loop: attack, miss, climb, stall, die. American pilots started calling it the Lightning Loop. What made it so effective wasn't just speed, it was control. With more reliable boost, the P-38 could throttle between power and glide without coughing or choking. The result? Smooth, devastating bursts of energy that caught Zeros completely off guard. Pilots who once dreaded dogfights began seeking them out. They'd taunt Zeros into chasing them upward, then twist back down and strike from above. Veteran Japanese aces couldn't believe what they were seeing. The same American fighters they used to dance around were now out-climbing and out-diving them, using raw power where finesse used to win. And the difference showed up in the numbers. Kill ratios began to shift. Squadrons that once came home half-strength started returning with minimal losses. Missions that were considered suicidal became routine. Pilots described the new Lightning as a different animal, meaner, hungrier, fearless. But it wasn't just about numbers. Morale skyrocketed. For months, American flyers had felt like underdogs, surviving on luck and teamwork. Now, they finally had confidence in their machine. They trusted it. That trust meant they pushed harder, flew higher, and took risks they'd never dared before. And each victory reinforced the myth that the Lightning had somehow evolved overnight. In truth, it hadn't evolved. It had been unleashed. A handful of mechanics, led by one man's reckless experiment, had given the P-38 back its bite. It could finally fight the way Lockheed's designers always intended, but faster, meaner, and louder. The Zero's reign of dominance was cracking, piece by piece, every time a wired Lightning took off. But with that new power came new questions and new dangers. Because the same trick that gave the P-38 its edge also pushed its engines to the breaking point. And soon, the line between brilliance and disaster would get razor-thin. For every pilot who swore by the wire trick, there was another who whispered that it was a ticking time bomb. Sure, the modified P-38s could now outclimb almost anything in the sky, but they were also running hotter, harder, and closer to the edge than Lockheed's engineers ever intended. And in wartime, flying on the edge is a dangerous place to live. Rumors started spreading through the maintenance tents. Some said the boosted Lightnings were blowing engines mid-mission. Others said turbochargers were cracking under the extra stress. The truth? It was messy. Some aircraft did come back smoking. Mechanics found warped valves, scorched turbine blades, and melted spark plugs. But ask any pilot whether it was worth it, and you'd get the same grin every time. Absolutely. Still, command wasn't so sure. Word of the field mod reached squadron leaders, then the higher-ups, who wanted answers. No one could officially admit that dozens of aircraft were running with unauthorized engine modifications. If Washington found out, heads would roll. So the story got buried under reports that said, performance variance due to environmental factors. No mention of wire, no mention of the mechanic. Even among the crews, there was debate. Some thought the mod was a stroke of genius, proof that real innovation comes from the ground, not the office. Others saw it as reckless tinkering that risked men's lives. After all, every time you wired the turbo open, you were gambling that the engine wouldn't cook itself in midair. But the results were impossible to ignore. Pilots flying wired Lightnings brought home better kill ratios, fewer engine complaints, and a noticeable shift in morale. That kind of success doesn't stay secret for long. Soon, whispers of the trick reached other squadrons, from Guadalcanal to New Guinea. Ground crews swapped tips, diagrams, and even photos, smuggled through mail and mess halls. It became an underground movement, mechanics quietly rewriting Lockheed's engineering in the name of survival. When Lockheed engineers eventually caught wind of it, they didn't shut it down. Instead, they investigated. Tests confirmed that the bypass increased turbo output by roughly 15%, improving climb rate by up to 400 feet per minute. It was risky, yes, but it worked. The fix that began as a field hack quietly inspired design tweaks in later P-38 models, which came with stronger turbo controls and better cooling, essentially making the trick official. To this day, historians argue about who that first mechanic really was. Some say he belonged to the 475th Fighter Group, others claim it started in North Africa before spreading east. No one can prove it. The paperwork doesn't exist, and the man himself never got credit. But ask any old Lightning pilot, and they'll tell you. Somebody out there changed the game with nothing more than a spool of wire and a bad attitude. And that's the beauty and danger of wartime innovation. The line between reckless and revolutionary is razor thin. Sometimes you don't know which side you're on until you land. But the legacy of that decision didn't end there. What came next turned the Lightning from a desperate survivor into a legend. By the end of the war, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning wasn't just another American fighter. It was a legend. And buried inside that legend was a secret no official report ever mentioned. A simple wire looped around a valve that had changed the course of aerial combat. The story of the wire trick became a kind of ghost tale among air crews, passed down from mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron. Nobody could prove exactly where it started, but everyone knew someone who swore it was real, and while the higher-ups never publicly confirmed it, the results were impossible to deny. The Lightning's later variants, like the P-38J and P-38L, rolled off the line with redesigned turbo controls, stronger boost limits, and improved cooling systems, all changes inspired by what had started in those dusty Pacific hangars. That little tweak didn't just make the P-38 better, it gave birth to a new way of thinking about wartime innovation. The message was clear. The people on the ground, the ones elbow-deep in grease and sweat, often knew things that engineers 1,000 miles away couldn't. Those mechanics understood how planes really behaved in battle, under pressure, in heat, with lives on the line. And the results spoke for themselves. The Lightning went from an unreliable diva to one of the most respected fighters of World War II. Its pilots shot down some of the most dangerous enemy aces, escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, and dominated high-altitude intercept missions that no other plane could handle. Even the legendary Richard Bong, America's top-scoring ace, flew the P-38 to his record-setting 40 kills. Historians still debate how much of that success came from official upgrades and how much came from field ingenuity. But for the men who lived it, there's no debate. They'll tell you the moment everything changed wasn't in a lab, It was on a runway when a frustrated mechanic broke the rules and proved that stupid ideas sometimes save lives. After the war, the lessons of the Lightning echoed through aviation design. Engineers began paying closer attention to feedback from field crews. Manuals became less rigid. Test pilots were encouraged to push limits instead of staying inside them. That mindset, born from a single act of rebellion, helped shape the way future aircraft were developed, from Korean war jets to Cold War interceptors. And while the name of that first mechanic may be lost forever, his fingerprint is everywhere. Every time a pilot pushes a machine beyond what the blueprint says it can do, that same spirit lives on. The wire trick wasn't just about performance. It was about belief. Belief that sometimes the people closest to the problem are the ones holding the solution. It's about daring to ask, "What if?" when everyone else says, "Don't." In the chaos of war, one man ignored the rules and changed the sky. And decades later, we're still flying in the world his idea helped create. But as with every legend, there's one last question left hanging in the air. Was it bravery or pure luck that kept it from ending in disaster? Every war is filled with stories of courage, sacrifice, and innovation, but few are as quietly powerful as this one. Not a general's grand strategy, not a secret weapon forged in some lab, just a lone mechanic, a stubborn plane, and a piece of wire. That's the part that sticks, the simplicity of it. No engineering degrees, no committee meetings, just instinct. Somewhere, under a blazing Pacific sun, one man looked at a problem that had grounded heroes and said, "There has to be a way." He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for permission. He just did it. And somehow it worked. That's what makes the story of the P-38's stupid wire trick more than just a wartime anecdote. It's a reminder that brilliance doesn't always look like a blueprint or a breakthrough. Sometimes it looks like desperation mixed with courage, a dirty hand gripping a wrench, and a mind that refuses to quit. Because of that, the P-38 Lightning found its wings again. With the modification, it could climb harder, dive faster, and finally face the feared zero on equal terms. The underdog became the hunter. The plane that once struggled to survive became the one dictating the fight. And while no one ever pinned a medal on that mechanic's chest, his idea echoed through every mission that followed. Every pilot who came home safe owed a little of that to a nameless man who dared to think differently. But there's a bigger lesson buried here, beyond the roar of engines and the clash of empires. It's about how progress really happens. We like to imagine innovation as something clean and deliberate, a spark in a lab, a eureka moment. But in truth, it's usually messy. It happens when someone breaks a rule, questions a design, or risks being wrong. It happens when someone does something stupid, and it works. That one act of defiance didn't just make a better fighter, it reshaped the culture of aviation. After the war, Lockheed and other manufacturers began listening more closely to field reports, trusting the instincts of the people who lived inside the machines. They realized that a pilot or mechanic under fire often knows more about performance than a designer behind a desk. That shift, born in the dirt and chaos of World War II, changed how aircraft were built forever. So maybe the story isn't really about a wire. Maybe it's about what happens when human ingenuity collides with desperation, when someone refuses to accept limits, when courage hides in the smallest actions. The P-38, Lightning became a legend, the Zero faded into history, and the mechanic who rewired fate disappeared into the background. But his idea? It never died. Because every time a pilot pushes a machine beyond what's safe, Every time an engineer takes a risk to chase a better design, they're echoing that same moment, the day one mechanic's stupid wire trick changed the sky. Sometimes, all it takes to rewrite history is one spark of defiance.